It's another good day to be responsible for equality and liberty. Our group is a group that supports our unqualified universal human rights for all people around the world. Our website is realcourage.org. That's R.E.A.L, COURAGE.org. We're here to speak today about the issue of the Egyptian Copts, but also from a slightly different perspective. What we'd like to do is to reach out not just to the Egyptian Copts and their supporters, but also to others of all faiths, and especially Egyptian Muslims, to seek what we call an undiscovered country, where human rights, human freedom, and freedom of conscience is not a privilege, but is an expectation for all people. As R.E.A.L has pointed out in the past, the Christians of Egypt, known as Copts, have been living under discrimination, oppression, persecution for about 1,400 years. A young nation such as the United States can barely grasp the concept of such a lengthy and protracted oppression of any group. America itself is only 234 years old. The International Declaration of Universal Human Rights was created just over 60 years ago. So I can only imagine the great frustration, discouragement, and resentment that any group would have that was persecuted for a millennium would have today. Furthermore, I can only imagine the great skepticism that any group that was persecuted that long would have, hearing advice from a young human rights group in America. But sometimes out of the mouths of babes come great wisdom and great strengths. And I hope that perhaps we might have that opportunity today. So, on behalf of Responsible for Equality and Liberty, we stand here in solidarity with the Copts and the Egyptian. But we also come to bring a message to the Copts' oppressors. To both the Copts and to their oppressors, I invite you to seek a path to a new Egypt, to an undiscovered country, where freedom of religion, where freedom of conscience, where our universal human rights of equality and liberty are not special privileges, but are guaranteed rights for all human beings. I invite you to pursue a path where human rights and peace are not considered as opposite choices, but are recognized as equal priorities. And I invite you to pursue a path where we leave our hate in the past and choose love for our future. America may be a young nation by Egypt's standards, but for a young nation we know a lot about hate. We know a lot about defying hate also, and standing up for our fellow human beings, universal human rights. America has and will continue to make a lot of mistakes on human rights. And I'll suggest for a second that we have a perfect record on human rights now or in the past. But what I do believe is that America has some lessons on some issues on human rights that we could share with both the Copts and Coptic oppressors to learn in going forward and finding peace and human dignity in Egypt and the future. In America, we struggled with a terrible disease of hate known as white racial supremacism that sought to deny Americans voting rights, employment, with nationwide discrimination and even attacks on non-white houses of worship. Our nation was divided and fought a civil war over this disease. Our nation had to come to grips with a 4 million member terrorist organization known as the Ku Klux Klan. 100 years after our national civil war, we had to fight yet another war of ideas in American places of work, public institutions, and schools for black civil rights for Americans. The black and other non-white victims of such oppression held rallies and protested They sought leaders, and they demanded their rights, not unlike the Copts in Egypt today. But the answer to this problem did not come only from the protests of the minority who were oppressed. Rather, it came from the majority who finally came to realize that such oppression was their problem and their responsibility to change. In my own lifetime, I have come from seeing a United States of America where black Americans were widely hated by many, with businesses that I saw with my own eyes that would only serve white clientele and had signs that said so, to a nation where a black American is president of the United States. My message to Egyptians, and especially to the Egyptian Muslims, is to recognize the power of love. It could have changed America, and it can change Egypt and the world. Egypt is not America. I know that, but we are all human beings. The human beings of any religion, any race, are still the same human beings as we are. The lesson that young America has for Egypt is that even the oppressors of others can realize our shared humanity and find the humility and shame to admit when they have been wrong. The lesson that young America has for Egypt is that there is always hope for any of us to change and to choose love, not hate. The lesson young America has for Egypt is that any of us can set a path for the undiscovered country where our human rights and dignity are inherent in our national identity, including in Egypt. So my message to Egyptian Muslims today is don't look just to the Coptic victims of oppression for all of the answers to the problems in Egypt today. Don't expect only the Copts and their diaspora around the world to deal with this problem. Egyptian Muslims, this is your problem and your responsibility. Egyptian Muslims, the change in Egypt and your government to end the millennium of oppression against Copts begins with you. Hate hurts us all. Rejecting hate is our shared responsibility as human beings, not only in Egypt, but in all of our shared earth. Some will say it's impossible for Egyptian Muslims to assume such responsibilities. And they will state that Egyptian Muslims cannot recognize our universal human rights, but only those rights dictated by the OIC Created Cairo Declaration. The only rights recognizes rights defined under Sharia. A decision to accept our unqualified universal human rights is also a choice that Egyptian Muslims must make if they seek to be part of the brotherhood and sisterhood accepting such unqualified universal human rights.